The UCLA finals.
There's some Sue's here too.
Oh, okay. Sorry, some Sue. Of course, we welcome our friends from instance. I actually don't go to UCLA. On the motion that this House would make the right to be forgotten from the Internet a civil right, call upon the Prime Minister to give a speech not to exceed 7 minutes. In his name. Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, we think it's absolutely perverse that the 21st century and technological advancements that come with it mean that people no longer have a right to their own privacy. It means that people no longer have a right to content that is created by them or about them, and more importantly, they have no right to manage content that is going to be potentially damaging to them in the future. We say with the age of the Internet, we require a new age of privacy laws, and the laws that we propose today are a civil right that allows you to erase all material of you on the Internet. One of the kinds of things, pernicious examples that exist in society that we think this will be most applicable to. We think it's applicable to revenge porn. We think it's applicable to embarrassing videos of you and things you do in college, which are used against you and your professional career later in your life. We think it's used for political videos and statements which you might make when you're younger and may no longer believe when you're older, but which are still used against you in your professional career. And moreover, regardless of whether it's a video of you or including you in it, we think it's about content that you've created or content that has been created about you. We think this debate extends to the grounds of like text, articles, everything that's been written by you expressing your opinions or about you criticizing you. We think all of that's fair game and we're willing to defend it. What do we think is going to happen and what's the model going to look like? We think it's fairly straightforward that if something becomes a civil offense, at the point where someone's unhappy with material of them that's being circulated online, they'll be able to take that offense up in a civil court of law. That means there'll be a plaintiff, a defendant, and that the case will be brought forth for why that material, and this is crucial, is harmful to either that individual or harmful to society. We think that the judge will be able, and the jury in those cases will be able to determine whether or not there's an honest and reasonable belief that this content's being circulated for like malicious intent against that individual or society. Crucially, concepts of honesty and reasonableness are very common in the law, and we think that that's not something which we necessarily need to defend, but that the law already works on. Clarification?
What if there is no malicious intent behind? I mean, does the right apply then?
Well, yes, it does, because to the extent that you want that video to be removed, we say that you have to have a good reason for that being used against you or counter to your interests as an individual, and like whatever that individual interprets to be, no thanks, like the intent that's being maliciously used against them, we say that that's something which we're going to support. Two arguments then coming out of opening government. Number one, about the principle of consent and how we don't believe it's possible for individuals to give consent in the modern age. And second, about how we remove the fear of later consequences and promote more content online that speaks to unpopular issues. First, on the principle. Before I even begin the argument, it's important for the clarity of this debate to talk about how it's a principle one. We think that this is debate about whether people should have the right to stand up if you want to be recognized, have the material about them circulated online. So in terms of the principle, we have three arguments to give you underneath this broad title. Number one is about consent. We think there are two fundamental aspects of consent that form a coherent and full acceptable version of consent. That is, number one, information about what you're consenting to, and number two, an environment where you're free from being coerced into that action. Our problem is with the first one, information. We say in the technological age, it's impossible to have the accurate information about who is going to get access to your content, what that content is going to be used for, and how long that content is going to be circulated in terms of your future. We say that there are parallels to be drawn here to number one, basic privacy laws in terms of like peeping Tom laws and the fact that we don't allow neighbors to just randomly look through their neighbor's window and look at them when they're in their own homes. We say that's like exactly the same as having a video of you circulated without your consent, without your information online that people are able to watch. We say it falls into that category. But talking about content and things which don't include you, we think it's analogous to affirmative sexual action laws which have recently been introduced in California and other places of the nation. Like the analogy there, which might not be immediately apparent, is that you have to give affirmative consent to every act that happens. In that case, it regards sex, but like the principle that's being extracted and applied here is that everything that is done to you or involving content made by you needs affirmative and knowledgeable consent by you as an individual. That doesn't exist under the status quo when anyone can download a video of you from YouTube, circulate it without your knowledge, and basically exploit your rights in that way. That's something that's abhorrent and we refuse to stand for. Second principled argument, however, is about ownership. We say that you should have a right to ownership of your content. And under the status quo, and with the internet being as widespread as it is, that there's no guarantee that you own all content that you basically have access to. What's an example of this? World University's debate championship finalist Bo from Harvard wrote an article on his Harvard Crimson account, which he found later was being circulated by the Chinese debate community and media as a source for learning how to debate from. And it was an article that he had written when he was a freshman. We say that that is a violation of the fact that he has ownership to content that he created. And we say that under the status quo, you can't do anything even if you realize that your content is being used without your permission, because people can argue that you put it online and therefore you knew that you were submitting to these kinds of harms and effects. We say that's not true. When you put content online, you don't submit and consent to everyone using it for whatever they want. We say you should be able to remedy that if you feel that it's unjust. Third argument about principle is an analogy to speech right now. What happens when people make comments about you which you feel to be untrue? We say that that is a civil offense right now in terms of defamation, and the final level of principled analysis we'd give you is that when material that you're being used online, this applies specifically to political videos and videos about your opinions, is being misused and not for the intention that you originally deigned it to be, that is an extension of defamation laws, and you should have the ability to remove that content from an online space. I'll take a point of information from Backhoff if you're offering.
Yeah, okay. So just to be clear, this is going to be done through civil litigation, and if so, how would one country's civil litigation process force another country, i.e. China, to take down content?
Right, so we understand that the majority of the things we're talking about do occur in the same society in the same countries, and we are talking mainly about civil litigation. We think that that extends to the broadest range of harms that I'm talking about in terms of the examples I gave you at the beginning. So what did I talk about, and how does that apply to the principle? We think that right now there's a perverse incentive for people to propagate things like revenge porn and embarrassing videos of people that they know because of the sole malicious intent that it's going to harm those people. That happens under the status quo because people feel like they can get away with putting content online that's going to harm another individual. We say that's not acceptable when you think that you can get revenge on your ex-girlfriend or boyfriend, which is something that happens in the same society and can be solved by a civil case. Those are the kinds of cases that we think we're largely trying to solve. Second argument, which is infinitely less important about practicalities, we say we remove the fear of later consequences, and this leads to more content about unpopular opinion. When Lee Kuan Yew died in Singapore, there was a video promoted by one very active member of the Singaporean community that praised his death. That video, although it had valid political viewpoints in it, was unpopular because it was published at the wrong time, received huge negative feedback, and resulted in that individual being put in jail. We say that at the point where you're afraid of consequences of your video being apprehended in the future, you're less likely to want to make unpopular content when you think it'll be propagated around the internet for forever. We say that when you introduce this law, it creates more of an incentive and more of an ability for you as an individual to produce unpopular content that'll test the waters of the political community, of any community and any level of beliefs, because we say that that's going to allow you to take it back if it's received negatively. I think I'm over time. And therefore we think it's good. This is a case about principles. We believe principally it's just and practically it has benefits. We propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for your speech. Call upon the Leader of the Opposition. Give a speech. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you. The Prime Minister massively misportrays the way in which information is used in a digital age. His argument is based upon the malicious distribution of material, essentially, whether that is explicitly malicious or a kind of implied malicious that I'll talk about. Here's the reality. Most malicious use of these material is already illegal under existing defamation laws. Revenge porn is illegal under defamation laws. Strictly speaking, stupid videos of you that make you look stupid is illegal under defamation laws. The problem is that the civil court system is entirely unable to enforce these laws, and therefore the motion would be entirely unable to address the problem it tries to solve. How is information really used? This is the question I'm going to try and describe for you. So he says that even when there's not clearly malicious intent, which is the case that's already covered, there is a kind of implied malicious intent. Otherwise, why would you not allow that information to be taken down? If you're not letting someone put that information off the internet, there must be some kind of malicious meaning. That's what he said. This is false. Information is valuable in of itself, even when it's anonymized, even when it's not like with your name on it. People will still want to have your information, not because of any consequences to you that they intend, but because of the value that it serves to the organization or the company that owns that information, that you have consented to give them that information, and perhaps consented to give them that information ad infinitum. So then he said consent is uninformed. Peeping Toms are without consent, yes, but they're without consent because you never said it's okay to look at me, right? That's the definition of peeping Toms. The difference here, he says this is analogous because people are also badly informed about contracts. When you're online, you don't consent to give your information forever, you think, but you do. 2 points to this. Firstly, this is an excellent argument that people should be more aware of their genuine online rights. But more broadly, I think that being aware of the way in which the content you put online may be used is a vital tool with or without this motion. If you think that the video you put up or the information you put on Facebook can be deleted, and therefore it's okay to put unpopular content, as he tries to argue, no thank you. This is a very dumb move, even with this motion, because you can see this with, for example, even without personal content, things like Game of Thrones being all over the internet, for example. If people want to share your information, it is in the nature of the internet, in the way that viral information is transferred, in the way that if people want to access your information, it is far easier to upload it in many, many places than it is to take it down with civil litigation, as evidenced by innumerable examples. Yes, please.
So you told us that people need to be more aware of what they consent to when they put things online. But the problem is, Facebook and YouTube tell you that you can delete your videos. People think they can get rid of them, but the truth of the internet is they can always be accessed. If they do, we want people to be able to get it out from that. How do you respond?
So if Facebook and Google are literally saying you can delete your content, but you actually can't, that is a legal failure in those companies, and I think that that would be a legal problem under existing laws. If you sign up to something and then they don't do what they're saying, that is already a breach of existing civil laws, and there's no need for this mechanism. However, if those videos, if what you're saying, and I think your implication is really that people don't understand the terms and conditions that they sign up for, nobody reads the damn things, then I think that your motion, this right to have your information deleted, would give them a false sense of confidence that they could rely on that information being deleted. Just like if I make a stupid video of me looking stupid, and I don't know, if I make a video of me kissing another guy, and then I feel really bad about that, and I want to get rid of it, but I've uploaded it and I can't. If I fought with this motion, I have a civil right that means I can delete this video. And so if I want to share it, it's okay, because I can remove it later. And then later, I find that even though in principle I can, I would first have to sue the company in order to do it under your mechanism, which is a big first step. And then I would find that even if I got the company to remove it under something like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which already exists, or defamation laws, which already exist, it would still be online if other people wanted that to be so. So I think that the key thing here is that the mechanism is entirely ineffective at addressing the problem it's trying to solve. The information will not be removed, and all you do is give people a false belief in their ability to kind of give that content. What does this motion take away? Information in a digital age is valuable. It's as valuable as currency. Information is property. It's property that you can agree to transfer to other people in exchange for goods and services. That is how Facebook and Google operate, and that is a broadly accepted kind of paradigm. The question is, who owns that information? And Gov have not persuaded us that because I am the one who generated that information, and then I, in a contract, exchanged it with someone else in order for them providing services to me, why do I still have an ownership of that information? There's this kind of philosophical disconnect in opposition's argument. By allowing people to have information that can be, so for example, in the status quo, it would be entirely reasonable to have contracts that say, this information can be deleted, or contracts that say, this information will never be deleted. Once you implement the motion, you only allow the second kind of contract, and that means that people who are happy to upload certain kinds of information, they're happy to be widely shared. I don't know, for example, the Google Fit app on my phone shares to Google how many steps I take per day. Google presumably uses information to, I don't know, improve the functionality of Google Maps or search for other companies and so on. I'm happy with that, and if I think I will always be happy with that, it should be okay for me to consent to let Google have that forever. I should be able to create those contracts. Why is it a benefit to me to be able to do that? Is because information that can be used reliably by other companies, that can be, that would, for example, if that information is anonymous, it would be impractical for those companies to try to remove that information. It means that that information becomes more valuable, and therefore companies have a better incentive to provide me with better goods and services. My property becomes more valuable under the status quo and becomes less valuable, less secure, and is a false sense of security in general in an ineffective motion which does not address the challenges it tries to face. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank the leader for their speech. Upon member, Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, a couple days ago I downloaded this app. It was called Bitmoji, and it asked me to accept an EULA, an end user licensing agreement. And obviously I accepted, but why did I accept? Well, I thought it's going to take way too much of my time, but secondly, I'm not going to be able to understand any of the legal language within this contract. Therefore, even if I put in the time and paid more attention to this thing, I still probably wouldn't know what is being said, all the while selling my rights and my likenesses to this person. I did this even though I disagree with it because there's no other way I can have access to this service unless we do that. On our side of the house, we think that the right to be forgotten means that end-user licensing agreements will now be able to be prosecuted like in a civil court. So what am I going to do in my speech? First, I think Arun tells you the principal part of our case, but then opposition decides to engage us on civil courts and also on contracts, right? So I think that then that's my burden, right? Is talk about civil courts, talk about contracts. So I'm going to get to some refutation. And then I'm going to get to a constructive point, which is why privacy is so important. First, what do we get out of the leader of the opposition? First, he tells us that whereas we're trying to stop revenge porn on a broad scale, they tell us that this has already happened. First of all, we say this is just in the most progressive states in the United States, for example, California and a few others. But secondly, we say that this is why we're expanding it to a more broad array, right? When we say that this is basically in effect more or less everywhere, right? So then I think I'll engage with how other countries are going to deal with this. Secondly, he talks about videos, embarrassing videos, not this time, and how they're regulated, right? And this is where we say, no, this just isn't true. People can have embarrassing videos posted about them, or photos of them drinking at a party, and they can't remove those, and then it affects their employment. Arun gives you this analysis. Then they talk about, now they get into contracts. They tell us about people consent to give their info ad infinitum, right? That just forever people can use their info. We say that first, people have no choice. But second, people don't know that they're doing this, and this is the most harmful part, right? So their solution is people should just be more informed about rights. We say, one, that this is blaming people and blaming the victims who are being taken advantage of by these companies. But two, Arun raises in a POI, he says people misunderstand what they're actually doing. They don't know that they're consenting to this thing. They think it can be deleted, and it ends up not being able to, because then that company says, oh, well, you signed an agreement that says anything you post is actually our property, not yours. We think that's abusive. Arun gives you principled argumentation as to why. Yes.
Okay, so I'm assuming the speaker is aware that there are two parts to the contract, the offer and the acceptance. The offer, of course, is the service that the company provides, and the acceptance is the acceptance of all of the terms that come with that. So basically, the choice that the person has in this case, if they don't want their data to be used, is simply not to give the data and not to use the service. When you consent to use the service, that is the same as consenting to all of the things that come with it.
Yeah, we think that that's an abusive contract and a false dichotomy, that someone has to basically sell their entire likeness to a company so that they can integrate on a social network with their friends, or talk about like a social movement, or they can talk about like the Arab Spring, for example. But in order to do that, they have to give up like their right to be forgotten, not this time. We think that that's what we're trying to solve, right? Is like how you give people more power in this power asymmetry that exists between services and the people, right? So secondly, they tell us this information can be removed anyway. We say, first of all, that like, they say the info will not be removed, right? Anyway, first of all, we say, yeah, actually, like it will, because at the point that like the civil court rules that this thing has to happen, that this can like then be removed from all second parties. But second, we say, even if it can't be removed from everywhere, we think that if we remove it from the place that has the most exposure, that's a lot better off. Like if we can remove someone's video or like a post that they had from Facebook, we think that that's a lot better off for that person psychologically. And if it's on like some third-party website that less people have access to, that's not as damaging. So we think that we're doing a good job there. And then they tell us at the bottom of their case, information is as valuable as currency. This is what we say is particularly harmful in the technological era that we live in, that people are exploiting the likenesses and the information of people for their own benefit. This is specifically, on this side of the house, what we are trying to stop. Now, let's get to some points about like the EULA abuses, right? So basically that people don't have the legal education in order to understand these things. They seem to be defending the status quo. They say these things are accurate. Have any one of us in this room ever read one of those things cover to cover? Okay, maybe you have because you're going to law school. But even so, right, I think that's a small minority. The rest of the people are being exploited, but congratulations to you. Secondly, we say that there's another reason this happens because there's no legal recourse anyway. Like once this person's privacy is violated, that in the EULA agreement it says, oh, the things that you thought were yours, no, they're actually ours. Therefore, the person can't really take that to court because that's actually the property of that second party. So now, why a civil court specifically, right? Well, first of all, we say that this is a civil right and therefore should be in a civil court. But secondly, we say that what a civil court does is it allows for compensation for damages, right? So that the person was exploited, and then this says, okay, because they were exploited by a company, that company has to pay for damages. But we also say three, and this is very important. What's the difference between a civil court and a criminal court? In a civil court, there is no jury. What does that mean? It means you can reach verdicts a lot faster. It means that a judge is the interpreter of legal information. There are a lot of problems with juries, but notably we say that they take a lot longer to have action. And we say that every minute that that person's information is up there and being exploited without their consent is a minute that is harmful to that person. We say that quicker action is better action in this case. Sure, I'll take back half.
Okay, so is the speaker also aware that civil courts also have juries and that the only difference is between a unanimous decision and a majority decision, and so juries are going to be inherent in either side, civil or criminal?
No, I think the main difference, right, is that civil courts usually just have one judge. In all criminal cases, there is a jury, right? We say that in civil courts this doesn't happen, right? And we think that timing is very, very important in a case like this, that a judge should be ruling rather than waiting for a jury. So now, why is privacy so important? Privacy is this idea, this notion that you should have control over what your expression is and how that is perceived by others, that they should not be able to have access to you if you do not want them to have access to you. We say that when your likeness is online and it is now able to be exploited, people are having access to you and you don't want them to have access to you, out of order. So we say that this allows for people's likenesses to be hijacked. This allows for then other people to go on exploiting that person when they want that information removed. Look at what we say about revenge porn, how that's online, and in a lot of cases that is not regulated, and because of end-user licensing agreements which say, sorry, that's not yours anymore, that's now in the domain of this porn site. Like, that's our property, and we've gotten millions of views on it, so yeah, good luck with that. You don't have a legal recourse. We think that the people should be able to have more power in this imbalance. We think that civil courts are the way to do this. We think that Arun gives you the principled argumentation. We tell you contracts are abusive. We don't think that the opposition really has built up a case for why this shouldn't happen. We urge a vote for the government side.
Here. Thank you, Deputy, for your speech. Call upon the Deputy of the Opposition.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. What a beautiful afternoon it is outside.
a very one-sided debate we are having here, but I'm here to show how one-sided the government is, and I'm here to expose some of their lackings. So, opposition agrees how the rights of individuals are being compromised with this law. Opposition believes that the rights of individuals are being impinged and we are getting too personal, we are infringing their privacy. That is, but there's something as collective interest. The problem is that the government only talks on the issue from the individual interest dimension. It has limited the dimension of the debate. It has limited the scope, and we are not approaching the topic from all sides. Where we have individual interest, we also have collective interest. Isn't that how the democracy is? Where collective interest prevails the individual interest, where what majority wants and what benefits the majority prevails over the individuals? No, not yet. Moreover, just as Mike has exposed few of the things, that it's not always about one person. Sometimes there are people who have been target of malicious attempt of their content being misused, but that's not always the case. There are benefits in not letting the people delete their information, and I'm going to tell that. I'm not just throwing a statement. I'm going to justify that in my arguments. My argument is divided into two main parts. The two main parts are, one part is ensuring security and safety of the majority of the collectively of many people by not letting people delete the information. And then the second point is for the well-being, on the choice of the family and the friends and the fans and the companies, and for the collective interest of the research and the educational society in the field, we don't let them delete their information. No. How security and safety? Law enforcement agencies and the government has successfully tracked, has successfully hunted down very notorious terrorists, criminals, warlords, by tracking them, by keeping record of their information on the internet. For example, the notorious John, the terrorist of ISIS, the head slayer who slayed many people and sent videos to UK, he didn't have right to delete those videos because those videos were used to use voice recognition. They were used to see the surrounding in which videos were recorded, and that's how they identified him, that he was UK citizen, and then they were able to go and track down his network and track down many more criminals who are already in the UK and in connection with them. So we have to think about the collective interest here. We have to think about how we can benefit from it. Always thinking about individuals' privacy, individuals' rights, and if we just debate only about that, we're limiting the scope. We have to think bigger. We have to open our mind. A little more time, please. Furthermore, how personal it can. Okay, moving to the third point, like the family and the friends and the fans and the company and the organization. For example, you are dead. You have passed away, but your family and the friends, they want you they still want you to be around, but they can't you have physically, but they only can have through your knowledge, your pictures, your information, your media, your Facebook group, your pictures, your videos. If you just by chance, like 10 years ago, you just had written this thing that delete all my stuff, and then you die, but your families and fans and the friends don't have liberty, those things to be there, so that they can remember you, so that they can feel you around you, so that they can learn from you, so that they can. So this thing is, in a collective interest, is not so beneficial. When you give your information to company and organization, what harm can they do to you? If they know that you were born in 1995, and if they know that you're male or female, what harm can they do? Education, the universities, they use this information in this statistical data. They use this information for the collective benefit and interest in research and education. So we have to think bigger. We have to think collective. We have to think collectively. Little more, please. For example, they are big personalities. They are politicians. They are sportsmen, and they have their legacy. They motivate millions of people. They inspire thousands of people worldwide. But once, for example, a sportsman dies like Muhammad Ali, and big politicians die like Obama and Bernie Sanders, people like that, if suddenly their media information from the social media is totally eradicated, then how will people relate back to them? How will people know what was their motivation, their inspiration? How will students learn from them? How will students of sociology do research on them? What is unique about them? So think deeper, think collective, rather than restricting yourself to individuals' privacy and individuals' right and not letting others do, like, there's much into it. I'll give you a chance.
So most of your analysis about collective benefit seems to ignore the large amount of videos that we think are largely personal, like revenge porn. But even if you want to talk about collective benefit, why do we have intellectual property laws and patent laws which say that you have a right to your property even if it might help everyone?
Absolutely, absolutely, I agree with that. My first line was that we totally agree that rights are being compromised. But in that thing, we need to have limitations, but we cannot totally rule this out because we are being dramatically benefited by this. We are preventing big criminal attacks. We are preventing, and we are not only preventing, we are also benefiting thousands of people in education, research, and all that. So there are also benefits and there are bad things. So in those kind of situations, we have limits, we have constraints. We can't totally rule this thing out. So I urge judges and I urge other people in this room to think collectively, to think open-mindedly, to not base their argument totally on personal interest, on their individual's rights, because that's how we have been doing for decades. Whenever rights of individuals come, we become very rigid. We just can't think anything outside the box. Think more, think open-mindedly, and think of collective interest and how we are being benefited. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Deputy, for the speech. Call for the member and open up the second.
Honorable Speaker, as our previous speaker recommended, we're going to think collectively, and we're going to tell you why collective data is actually really detrimental and harmful in the status quo, especially when you are not giving the individual the right to be forgotten on the internet and not making this into a civil right. But first on to reputations, and then I'll go over my new positive matter. Basically, they come up here and tell you the well-being of the collective interest, and how collective interest is actually a really good thing. However, they fundamentally misconstrue the argument at the point when we're actually talking about the brink point where the individual no longer wants that information to be online, and that individual, then we're saying that we should actually give the agency to the individual to actually make the decision whether or not they should or should not be forgotten. So, sure, like some data on the internet can be a good thing, but we're saying that when the individual wants to take it down, then they should have that personal agency and that personal individual power to be able to take it down. But sure, before I go on.
Criminals and corrupt politicians want to remove evidence and make themselves harder to identify and track. Don't let them. Further, patent laws are collective by encouraging research.
We're going to argue that the detriment that you actually do by taking away this right to be forgotten is actually more detrimental, especially when it comes to the collective, or when it comes to the entire majority of the population who are actually not politicians, and how this can actually be very detrimental to the society, even to a point where the harms, actually will outweigh the benefits. So basically, if you look to their entire lines of argumentation, they just give you very broad rhetoric as to why data in the internet is good. At the point, we're not telling you that data in the internet is a bad thing. We're just saying that the individual should have the individual agency and the ability to take it down. We're going to state that this is actually going to be the government win. Another argumentation against their point of information that they just made about corrupt politicians is like there are other mechanisms to check back for corrupt politicians. Like we're talking about the individual in a current society, like a general, like a basic civilian, more than a politician's perspective. So let's move on to new positive matter. First, I want to talk about the harms of collective data. But before I go on, yeah, your point.
Can you give me the legal ramifications for individual agency, like what case law, what precedent creates individual agency?
I don't think that should be the premise of the argumentation in itself. I think what we should argue in today's debate is whether the individual should be given the agency and the right, and the individual, basically the individual agency, whether they can or cannot be forgotten within the internet realm in itself. So back on to my harms of collective data. Basically, when a person signs a contract, they actually do not sign this part of the deal, where it leads to basically a chain of different parts, where big corporations actually gather and buy data from different data collection companies, and this kind of data selling is actually not a big part of the contract in itself. And we're going to state that this actually has two very big political and economic ramifications. First, on the political perspective, we can see that people can actually use this kind of big data for basically psychologically profiling and targeting different types of people. And this can be used basically as a political machine. We're going to state that at the point when you're not aware that you're actually signing your contract, signing in your data away to be sold into a data mining company, and then to be sold into another like political machine, that's the point when we're going to state that there needs to be a check-back system of these individuals being given the right to be forgotten in itself. Let's look at the economic ramifications. At the point when they're stating that my data can be used for big data targets, even if I don't want it to, but I don't really know that it's actually going to happen because the contracts don't specifically say so, this is actually being really unfair, and that you're basically being forced to unfair business practices and people selling their information to the highest data bidder in itself. And so this is going to have very big economic ramifications when it comes to the last evaluation, when we actually look to see whether individual agencies should be given on a utilitarian and practical perspective in itself. But let's look on to the basic generics of contracts now. We're going to state that contracts in itself are generally fundamentally problematic. At the point when all these words are very vague in itself, then it's actually a very problematic status to kind of make this promise on. Not only this, you can look to the very basics of internet in 1990. When you signed a contract in 1990, you have no idea how technology is going to advance in 2016 right now. And so therefore, that kind of unknown implications of the long-term perspective makes you need a check back to these kinds of contracts in itself. So therefore, we think that the right to be forgotten gives this individual agency the perfect amount of check back system for this kind of technological advancements and changes that can actually happen within the technological sphere in itself. Also, we state that even if contracts end up being good, there's also, you're risking the possibility of getting hacked. So individual, no matter like how good the security is, you risk the possibility of getting hacked. And the only way to avoid this issue is if the individual is given the choice to retract back their information from the information that they've actually being given. And so therefore, we think that the agency and the right to be forgotten is actually very crucial for these reasons. Now let's move on to how like the communication perspective is affected by this. What you say in real life, well, I guess right now because I'm being recorded, it is being preserved. But on a generic perspective, like it's not preserved. Like when you go up here to a person and say something, then it's actually not being preserved. Just because the internet is just a new medium of expression in itself doesn't mean that that actually needs to get preserved in itself. So we think that this is actually a very crucial argumentation. Not only this, you also we believe that the information that you put out on the internet in itself is an intellectual property to the individual, and the person has that right to that property. And so also, we think that internet is actually not a social contract, and it's just an exchange of services, so you actually do not have to give up any right. And so therefore, that check-back system to allow for the right to be forgotten given by the legal system in itself is very crucial for not only the individual agency, but to stop the harms of collective data that comes from ambiguous contracts and to check back for the contracts in itself. And so for these three reasons, you're going to be specifically giving back half of the government team the ballot today. Thank you.
Hear, hear. Thank the member for their speech. Call upon a member of the opposition. Open the back half for their side.
Right, so we're going to begin today by going on to the positive matter in this debate, and first of all looking as to why this isn't going to solve anything in terms of the harms that were presented in this case, but also moving past that, looking into why the positive matter is so far outweighed by the negative matter we're about to bring out today. So let's begin with the positive matter. One of the most important things that was not contested throughout this entire round was the idea of civil litigation being used to solve for all of these harms that were brought up, such as revenge porn, right? So one of the most important things is that there are 300 million people in the United States, and there is no way the amount of court cases that the affirmation plans to have heard can even be reasonably heard within our justice system currently. The amount of new cases that would come in as a result of this, of people wanting videos taken down by the internet, and then having to go, number one, to pay a lawyer, which is extremely expensive and which would disenfranchise the lower classes of the United States, but number two, to actually go through the full legal process of having all of these things taken down, not to mention the tremendous costs of all of this litigation as well, are just absolutely, they cannot be understated, right? So the fact of the matter is that the first thing we're going to have is just a tremendous amount of backlog as a result of this, right? So the majority of cases that they state will be solved for are never even going to be heard in court simply due to the tremendous amount of cases that are going to be put forth and the tremendous amount of backlog that are going to occur as a result of this. Moving into their positive matter. Basically, we can boil down the affirmation, the first aff, to one thing, consent, right? So I brought up in multiple POIs about the idea of consent and the idea of contract, which it appears the affirmation today fundamentally does not understand. You see, one of the most important things when it comes to contract is the offer and the acceptance. The offer is we can use Facebook, and the offer that comes with that is when you use Facebook, we get to use your data, and you accept that. You accept that when you go, okay, for your service, I'll take this harm, right? And that's the whole way the contract works, just like a credit card, right? So nobody can go and get a credit card and just go, well, I didn't really read the contract when I signed it. Now that I have all of this credit card debt, I'm just going to not consent to this anymore and then just be done with it, which is basically what the affirmation is saying. Because the thing is, you have the choice to not use the service, just like you have the choice to not use a credit card. But the instant you choose to use the service is the instant you accept the ELUA, and the instant you accept the contract, just in the same way the instant you use a credit card means you accept all of the terms and interest and etc. that come with it, which is fundamentally misunderstood by both halves of the halves of the affirmation today. They don't understand the fundamental idea of contract and the fundamental idea of consent, and that consent is inherent in the acceptance of the contract and the use of the service. Before I go on, yes?
So the way that the argument about consent was developed is we had a problem with information, and that's been argued up to the end there. We told you that information and its latest culmination was that information, even if it is presented, is manipulated in such a way that it's hard for the everyman to understand. Why is that not still a violation of the principle of consent?
Very simply because there's already things in the United States and in our legal system that already solve back for this. The idea is that number one, when you are accepting a contract, there must be an understanding between both parties. The fact that you did not understand the contract that you signed is already legal precedent without your plan to actually bring civil litigation in court, which means that your solvency is not anything greater than the status quo currently. When you don't understand, you can already sue and you can already get out of a contract. Moving off case. Or sorry, into the negative matter. Right. Number one, we talk about such minor harms such as revenge porn today, but we don't talk about some of the more major harms that can truly be brought up as a result of this. Number one is that this right is going to allow sex offenders and criminals to take down information about their crimes from the internet, referring, of course, to the opening opposition today, right? Sex offenders and criminals have the right because, again, since this is being used against them in order to get them to go to jail, or if it's going to be used against them, say that information as blackmail, right, of the crimes that they've committed, they can actually have this information removed from the internet, which is absolutely ridiculous. This information needs to be public use with the idea, again, of communal benefit as the negation is brought up today, right? The idea of communal benefit is so important here, and the individual benefit of one person not having people know that they're a sex offender is far mitigated by the fact that people should know that they're sex offenders, right? Moving on to our second point. So I think there's a fundamental point that's been completely missed here today, which is the idea of libel and the idea that anybody can sue for malicious use. And the most important part of this is political figures, right? This completely destroys freedom of the press under the affirmations plan today with the very simple idea that any type of information that's presented against a political candidate, any type of information that's presented against a public figure, any type of information of any type such as that can immediately be sued against, which means that the information that we rely on so heavily, satire and political commentary and freedom of the press in the United States for people to express their opinions is inherently being censored because now the instant you present your opinion and someone decides, well, I don't really like the way you've presented me in your opinion, can actually sue you in court not only for damages but also to take down this information from the internet. This is one of the most fundamental violations of free speech I've ever heard of in my entire life. This impact cannot be understated. This is such an enormous impact in this round that this can be weighed out against everything that the affirmation has brought up today. The fact that we can use this to censor the press, and the fact that large companies can litigate, especially with all of that money, and bring infinite litigation against people that say terrible things about their company or people that express their opinions, completely destroys the First Amendment and completely destroys the right to free speech. Before I move on, yes?
Yeah, so there are already defamation laws that include like what the press can put out. But we think that on this idea of collective benefit, right, that we think that most people, if they're criminals, are not going to take advantage of this because that means they're going to have to show up in court and say, I want my video of me abusing a minor taken down. No, that instantly shows them to the legal justice system. They're not going to use it.
Or even better for them, they go to civil court before they go to criminal court and get the evidence expunged. Even better. Anyways, moving on to the third point, right? Onto our third point, which is that basically members of government can use this to get rid of evidence, and basically the whole concept, okay, the one point that we really want to bring up here is the ability of suppression, the ability of censorship that's brought about by this law. The fact of the matter is that this type of precedent, to say that you can delete something permanently from a website as a result of the fact that it quote-unquote maliciously attacks you, as the second half is brought up, or even as the first half is brought up, which is that you just want to delete it because you don't want it there anymore, right? This can't be understated. This basically means that anytime a political figure says something, anytime someone satirizes them, that person can now be sued for damages, number one, and that person can now have that video be taken down. And the fact of the matter is, the way that they present this civil litigation is in a way that's going to be like, okay, you want this gone? Okay, it's gone. You want this gone? Okay, it's gone. So basically what's going to happen as a result of this is that all of this litigation is going to be put up, and all of this important information, all of these important factors in this, in America, all of these important factors that we get from freedom of the press, that we get from varying people's opinions, are going to be destroyed. We are destroying knowledge in the United States as a result of this. We are destroying opinion in the United States as a result of this. We are destroying freedom of the press in the United States as a result of this. This cannot be understated. And because this impact is basically the only impact to weigh in this round, because this is so far-reaching, because this is so far damaging, because the potential of this law is so huge, we have to urge a negative ballot. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Member Opposition. Call upon Government Whip. Close out this side. Speaker.
In George Orwell's 1984, he depicts a nice picture of what we get with side opposition's world, right? Wherein the government is allowed to surveil its citizens, where citizens do not have the ability or the right to have privacy in their information. On side opposition, what you'll find is that eventually you'll get into a world wherein your behaviors as someone who has information on the internet will be so predictable that they could potentially be advocating for things like Minority Report, wherein they can just arrest you before you commit a crime because they have these psychological behavioral science behind them. And we say, on side government, say people have an inherent, you're out of order, man. You have an inherent right to privacy, right? There are three crystallizing questions in this debate. The first is, what is the nature of consent? The second is, how are individuals affected? And the third is, how does society change? Under the first point, opening government comes up here and they tell you what the nature of consent is in very much detail, actually. And throughout this debate, all we get out of side opposition in response is that, look, these people agree to the terms of this contract. But what you find out of back half, when Andy comes up here and tells you that, look, someone who put information online in 1990 could not even know the implications of what that does in 2016. When Joe tells you that the contracts that you have to sign on a daily basis are so big that it's just easier to click I agree because you don't understand the ramifications of that, we say that consent has been malformed in the version it takes online. Opening.
Gov said that the only way to avoid hacking is to be forgotten. No, the only way is to be careful what you upload and not have a false sense of security from this motion. Hacks and other harms are on our side.
Right, and so as Andy tells you, just because the medium of communication has changed in a globalized world does not mean that you should have harsher rules on that communication. At the point where their only objection to this idea is that somehow, oh my god, like pedophiles, their information won't be public anymore. I tell you, guess what? We have a government for that. That's what the Fourth Amendment is for. We're not saying no more warrants. What we're saying is, if you have personal property on the internet, you should have the right to destroy that that property. At the point where they tell you, no, civil courts are an insufficient mechanism because it's too hard, I tell you that when something is a civil right, you have an inherently better chance of getting it removed. At the point where we have 3 types of scrutiny, strict scrutiny, medium scrutiny, and rational justification, currently we're at rational justification, which means as long as you can provide some type of rational justification, then you can prevent that person from their right of information, of their personal information. At the point where it becomes a civil right, you actually get to strict scrutiny, wherein that person's civil right, because it is a right, is so powerfully upheld that you cannot just strike it away without very, very good cause, right? And because there's a strong distinction between those 3, we say that even if you are attacking the mechanism, which by the way is not what BP about, but I'll take you at your best, then you still win on that cause, right? Back half.
Okay, so can you tell me in civil litigation where the right to privacy comes from?
Right, so again, when you keep asking this precedent question, and we don't care, what we're debating about is the idea, right? When we tell you that when you change this policy, this is how the courts are going to look, this is how the courts will enforce this, and you say, oh, what's the status quo, and how was that gotten to? We say, it's not gotten to because that's the policy we're proposing. So please stop saying that. It's like the second time I've heard you say that. The next question, how are individuals affected? Out of back half, Andy comes up here and she tells you, right, that these people have their information that's being abused. And I tell you in my opening narrative that, like, George Orwell predicts this in 1984, where he says, look, people could not possibly understand the implications of, like, future scrutiny. They couldn't possibly understand the implications of what their private information will look like in the future. And eventually that information will be exploited. When Andy tells you, look, there are 2 main ways this is going to hurt us, economically and politically. At the point where politicians don't have to actually target anything towards anyone but the people whose behaviors they can predict, then we say that's bad. In a democracy, you should inherently be pandering to everyone, not just like the few people who you think you can convince based on their behaviors. 2, at the point where Andy tells you that, hey, look at the economy. Look at what this will do. When big businesses can buy this data, by the way, without consent of the user, and then it gives them an inherent edge against other competition and creates cronyism within our capitalist system. We say, look, those are 2 very tangible causes that are directly linked to this resolution, and that's why we win on both of those. She also tells you that, look, our agency as individuals will be undermined when we don't have a right to forgetting our own information on the internet. Just because the medium has changed, once again, does not mean we are subject to harsh rules. On side opposition, what we get is that, look, people subject themselves to this, and that's great because everyone understands every word of a contract and they should all read it beforehand. And then they say, look at credit cards. Like when you sign a credit card contract, you don't get to forgive your debt. And I say, yeah, that's true, except for look at the fact when your credit card information is stolen, we think that that goes outside the contract, right? We think that when your information online is stolen, but it's collected by data against your consent, we think that's inherently bad. We've shown you the harms of that, and they have no reconciliation except for they think that somehow civil courts are insufficient, which I've already refuted. Top half.
What is the direct harm to individual person if politicians and companies use their information, which is mostly available on the public also?
Right, okay, so 1, your personal information is not mostly on the public unless it's been doxed. 2, when you look at how your idea of like, oh look, corrupt politicians are going to like hide their data, we say, again, if the FBI is like investigating a corrupt politician, they have warrants to do that, they have FISA courts to do that. All of those mechanisms are still in place. You're not destroying the law and the justice system. All you're doing is giving people an inherent right to their data. It's not like this extreme cause. It's not anything beyond like simple respect for someone's data. We've been doing it since the beginning of this country. We've been doing it since the beginning of democracy. People have a right to privacy, and you don't provide any type of reason as to why we shouldn't do that. 3rd, how does this affect society and how does society change? What we find is that on their side of the house, the only thing they say is like, look, we get all these better benefits, like we found ISIS because of the internet. Look, if we steal people's personal information, we can do better. What we say is like, okay, at the point where you're just saying like, oh, they're using universities to send people emails so they go to universities, we say, okay, interesting, because they're also using that information to target voters, they're also selling that information to corporations to get the competitive edge. But also, when you say that, look, we're going to find ISIS, we say the most important element of finding like foreign threats is actually on the ground intelligence, not online. Don't be confused. We didn't find out who the leader of ISIS was because he sent a video killing people. We found out who the leader of ISIS was because he's the leader of ISIS and he's killing people, right? We have like intelligence on the ground, which is more effective at gaining that information. On our side, Andy comes up here and she tells you, she's like, look at the political implications, look at the economic ramifications, look at how this will look in the future. When you sign a contract today, you are inevitably dooming yourself to things that you don't know in the future. And because of that, you should have an inherent right to that information. So if at some point you decide, you know what, I didn't like that thing that I proposed about myself. I didn't like the way that I am perceived. I don't like that corporations can steal my data, which is something I didn't even know could be the case when I signed on to this contract. Guess what? You have the civil right to not have that happen to you. You have the civil right to have that information be forgotten. Look, At the end of the day, they provide you no benefits of any substance. You're out of order. They provide you no mechanism. They provide you no valid attack. All they say is that this is bad because the status quo can't solve, and I've shown that it absolutely can't solve. I've shown the harms. This is already a government battle.
Thank you, Government Whip. Call upon the whip for the opposition and close out the debate. Okay.
Are we looking for that?
Yeah, a little bit. Ladies and gentlemen, the government team wants to walk in here and play barrister and change the laws and affect civil litigation, and yet they've openly conceded to you that they know nothing about the legal process. This debate boils down to two different modes of analysis. On one hand, you have the opposition, clear-cut and technical, saying that information is useful for many purposes, for collective interest, for catching criminals, for making sure child rapists remain known as child rapists, to make sure that politicians don't coerce voters and the press into preventing them from publishing articles that attack them. The opposition wants to stop censorship. Now, on the other hand, we have the government team who was so lazy they didn't even read a contract. They're trying to change the way we litigate the EULA, the End User License Agreement, and all of them have openly admitted none of them have read it. So basically, they're trying to treat the entire country like children because they didn't read it, nobody should have to read it, even though they should be able to take it to court and litigate it. The kind of recklessness and irresponsibility on the government team is what's driving this country into the ground. And I'll give you two examples. First, this concept of individual agency. You know, the government team accuses us of using words that don't mean anything. What is individual agency? What does that even mean? And we ask, can we have some sort of legal ramification for individual agency? Oh no, we shouldn't talk about that. You see, the government wants to talk about the law without really giving you any legal justification. The same goes for the right of privacy, which their last speaker didn't give us a legal justification for it. They don't know any legal precedent about these two things, yet they're trying to push them into civil litigation. Obviously, the government should lose because they're trying to change the law by inserting concepts into it which they know nothing about. They have no knowledge of any precedent whatsoever, and right now one of them is going to try and get up and correct me, even though it's too late. You've already showed the entire opposition you don't know how common law works. But most importantly, they don't know how case law works. They don't know how contract law works. They think people shouldn't have to consent to contracts, that I can just click the terms and agreements because I don't feel like reading them, and then they get surprised when they can't take their videos off the internet. That's what this debate boils down to. Now, like I said, the opposition has shown clearly that data is used for collective interest under the way that the government has structured this debate, and I quote, erase all material of you. That's what their first speaker said. Malicious intent is not necessary for them. That's what they said. That means I, as a pedophile, as a sex offender, can ask the government to take down any electronic data of my wrongdoings. Nobody will ever know that I was a child offender. Under their definition of this plan, no one will ever know what I've ever done. Yeah.
So I won't pretend like I understand the law better than you do, but we think it's false for you to say that we didn't explain our criteria. We told you that consent had two very clear parts, and our problem with contracts was, number one, even if people read them, they don't understand them, but number two, even if they read them and understand them, they can't predict what they'll be used for in the future. Could you do us a favor and respond to our, whatever knowledge we do have?
Yes. When you read a contract, it explicitly says what the contract does. That's usually how litigation works. I don't think I need to explain much of that, but I'm going to move on from that anyway. So going back to this issue of collective interest, you know, sex offenders aren't the only thing. It's also the press. When we say the press publishes articles about politicians, under their new law, politicians can just say, oh, well, it interpreted me the wrong way, it hurt my feelings, so take it down. This is how Donald Trump becomes president. If ever the media tries to slander him, he'll just say, oh yeah, no, that's offensive, take it down, it was malicious intent. But hey, under their framework, you don't really need to prove malicious intent. Not at the moment. Okay, another thing. Politicians. We always try to hold politicians accountable. America has a precedent of holding politicians accountable. If footage gets around that they did something bad, they can just say, under their civil rights, you need to take that down, it's incriminating, it's malicious, and we'll never know who we're actually voting for. But
yeah, so as I've already said and you've ignored for some reason, their government actually in the justice system still exists. You haven't reconciled that. You just say that we don't know anything, and if we don't, then maybe you can explain it to me. How is that changing under the status quo?
Sure, let me tell you. Okay, once again, let me quote your government leader to you. He said that under these conditions, we would erase all material of a person, 1, and 2, malicious intent is not a necessary burden. You don't even have to prove damages. So under this law, I can go up to any publication willy-nilly and say, you're victimizing me, and by law, I can sue them and have them take it down. That's basically what your law did. Your law is so vague that anything can happen, anything goes. So the bottom line is that the opposition wins today because we've shown you the usefulness of data. Data can prevent crime. It can prevent people from getting hurt and censored. Individual agency and privacy are not rooted in law, and they can't prove that to you, but getting hurt, getting molested, getting sexually assaulted, and getting censored are all causes of action in the law. When the debate comes down to which arguments are more legally relevant, the opposition has clearly shown you that we deserve the ballot, not them, because we clearly know more about the law. I'm not going to be taking any more. So let's talk about our stakeholders. Who stands to benefit from this never making it into the halls of any legislature ever? Well, for one, voters who like to know what their politicians are doing. 2, people who have a vested interest in not getting raped and not associating with people who are rapists, who have maybe taken down their information thanks to this new law. 3, victims of sexual assault. 4, people who want accountable government. 5, the press. This article, this law is incongruent with the First Amendment. The First Amendment says that freedom of the press shall not be abridged. Under their law, we can abridge press as much as we want. This is a very simple discussion. The government whip seems to be on the right side because he talks about how censorship is whipped. I mean, how censorship is so prevalent, but when you're whipped by the government, you know, it kind of figures. The bottom line being is that this is our last-ditch effort to save our country from being censored not just by politicians, not just by the rich, but by the government intrinsically. They don't understand the law, and if I may quote their last speaker, we don't care. Well, that's what happens when you let the government team write policy. Bottom line is, litigation should pick up this ballot. The opposition should clearly win this round. We've demonstrated a clearer understanding of the importance of data, how it can be used to save lives and human dignity, whereas the only thing the government team has given us is flimsy rhetoric and buzzwords like individual liberty and autonomy and privacy, which cannot be justified in a court of law. John Adams once said, facts are stubborn things. I think the only more stubborn thing is the government's attempt to refuse them. Thank you.
Here. Thank the officers for their speech. Please step outside, shake hands, mow it over, and I'll call you back in.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Good speech.
Oh yeah.
This isn't closed in your head.
What?
This isn't closed in your head.
Oh my god, we look so like.
Go on.
I know.
I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense that it's open, but that's okay. Thanks.
Would you mind standing at the podium?
Do I mind saying anything?
Yeah.
I don't like that anymore. I like this one.
Oh, you like it?
I like the crappier one.
Okay.
Less in perspective.
Suspense, guys.
Oh my god.
Which records whatever has been written by. Yeah, everything.
Okay, everyone.
Okay, shh. Quiet. Sit down.
It was a great debate. I'm just going to go ahead and start off and just give you the motions. Like I said, the last round, the majority of you are probably not going to like me, 3/4, and 1/4 will really like me. So feel free to ask me any questions afterwards, and I'd love to give you more feedback. But basically, so I gave the 1 to the opening government, the 2 to the closing opposition, the 3 to the closing government, and the 4, unfortunately, to the opening opposition. And so here's why. Working back from the 4. So I thought that the clash at the top was great. I thought that the opening opposition presented a lot of the basic points that later were taken up by the closing opposition. But I did think that you missed a lot of things that the closing opposition was able to go after. So I thought that the point of the journalistic purposes, that was left out of the model. When I was first thinking about this model, the fact that they left out exemptions for journalistic purposes and that was capitalized on by the closing opposition, I thought was a very large point that was missed, that it would be utilized primarily by people who have money, who are trying to avoid future criticism. So like this is actually already being done in Europe. This law is, which actually I was surprised that no one mentioned, you should probably look it up, but that this is actually happening in Europe, and actually they have exemptions for journalistic purposes. You're not allowed to like try and go out and get your things removed. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. The 3, so I gave the 3 to closing government, and that was a really close 3-2, honestly. It was really tough, and I think ultimately what it came down to was I thought that the back half of opposition had enough new material, whereas a lot of your material I felt like was taken by the opening government. It was a little bit too derivative for me, though I do recognize that you had a lot of some sort of minor arguments that had some smaller stakeholders considered. So like for instance, if you were hacked, how does that play out like this? If you allow people to have their information removed, maybe it lessens the chance that they're hacked, things like that. I just thought that those aren't really the spirit of the motion, that some of the stakeholders that you were considering, though fair and though real, probably weren't the bigger fish in the round. And so moving up the ladder, I think we gave the 2 I gave the 2 to closing opposition, because ultimately I think, first of all, just in a VP round, opening government has a harder task. So simply on role fulfillment, you're able to develop arguments for an extra 30 minutes, and I think your arguments weren't necessarily, like they were new from the opening, but they weren't necessarily able to still defeat an argument. I think that you did provide a very good weighing mechanism, and maybe it was questioned in my mind. But I do think that ultimately what this round came down to was your practical harms of how does this actually play out in the future versus their harms for, and they were for like certain stakeholders, so say for politicians, say for criminals. Like you segmented your speech in a lot of different stakeholders, which I thought was beneficial to your case. But their case was juxtaposed the entire population, right? Like the average person who goes on the internet, and the average person who engages in these contracts, if that's what you could call them. They're not. I don't really think they're recognized as like contracts per se. I think they're license agreements that you're agreeing into. But a lot of the times, I think just socially, we don't think of them as binding, as if you're like signing something. People they do like they say, just click and not read. Like there's whole books written on if you actually did read all of the agreements that you like agree to, it would take like years. So I think like the average person doesn't actually read these things, and so that was like the question that they put right at the beginning of do we actually consider these to be legitimate contracts? And they questioned that from the get-go. And I think throughout the opposition bench, you just kept assuming that it's the case that all of society thinks that they're contracts. And maybe legally they are contracts, but I don't think that the general person views them as legitimate as, like, say, other contracts, like their credit card, like their mortgage, you know, like those sorts of things. So I think, like, that consent argument of should you still be held accountable for something that you didn't necessarily agree into for, like, ad infinitum, right? I think that ultimately is what persuaded me, and then the fact that they were able to fulfill their role as the opening government and bring out those arguments right from the get-go without, you know, the extra prep time to be derivative or to, you know, use somebody else's argument and determine it. I think ultimately is what put them over. But if anybody else has any questions, I also think that, like, yeah, in general, I think, like, this topic is a tough one, and so, like, you guys all did, like, excellent jobs, and your speaker points are really good. But I think, yeah, definitely looking into some of the other cases where this is happening, right? Like, it's happening all throughout Europe. Like, France did it in 2010. The UK's done it for a while. That, like, there are the right to be forgotten is a thing in Europe. It's not in America yet, but it's also in, like, Argentina. That, like, this whole thing has played out, and that journalistic criticism was, like, one of the big things. So that's why I consider that pretty high. But yeah, so that's my...
Okay. Thank you for judging and giving your critique on tape. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sir, what was your name, by the way?
Professor Tom Miller, UCLA.
Nice to meet you, Phil.
Nice to meet you, Steven Sands.
So I'll send it to your coach. You're SMC, right?
Yeah, Luis Andrade.
What?
Luis Andrade is our coach.
Who?
Luis Andrade. You'll find him. He's...
I have somebody else listed as your coach, but
that's
they'll
fine,
get
that's
it
fine.
to
Nate
you.
Brown, yeah, Nate
No,
Brown.
there's a girl I have. There's a girl.
No, fair enough.
Okay, well, someone will eventually...
Well, if you want to give... Here, I can give you my card if you want to... If you don't get it in a week or two.
Yeah, thank you.
But just look online in about 2 days under Thomas Miller. And, Jared, let me finish talking to you two real quick while it's still fresh.
We need all the teams down back as soon as possible.
Okay, we'll be there as soon as possible. So, so you got the 3. I thought it was going to go this way. I thought they almost were going to pull an upset. What did you think of the rankings?
I thought we should have gotten the 2.
You thought you should have gotten the 2.
Like, sure, their arguments were new, but that's only because, like, Joe and Arun took all the argument? Or, like, not took in a mean way, but, like, they did a good job.
They set it up, yeah, and they didn't leave you much, yeah.
No, I mean, I could see, once he explained it like that, like, I could see us getting the 3 over them getting the 2. My whole thing about them is like, I didn't buy their arguments for, even if I was, like, removed from the debate, I couldn't buy their arguments, because, like, 1, you guys don't know shit about law. Like, okay, but you didn't give us analysis of that. 2,
yeah.
Like, oh, look at, you're gonna, like, let child rapists have, like, privacy. I'm like, okay, well, I already told you that's not gonna be the case. But, and then they provided no analysis against, like, my refutation. So I feel like our refutation kind of stood, but I could also see us getting the 3 and them getting the 2. So.
Yeah.
My only other thing I wanted to say to you real quick, Andy, was I like your answers to the POIs that you took. I would have liked a little better preview and a little better linking to, you did it a couple of times. That's why we need the civil right. That's why we need a right to be forgotten. We need the civil right. Remember what the issue is at hand. Jared, you're still a little aggressive. You're out of order, man. How about just you're out of order, dude, or just hey, you're out of order. Okay, but that's cool. Civil rights rational justification cannot strike it away. What was that about? Why did I comment out? Why did I write that in red? Do you know?
No.
Yeah. Oh, okay, I know. Your George Orwell thing I liked. The thing about big business, I didn't think that Andy developed that so well. I think you could have added to that a little bit. I guess your answer to ISIS was pretty good. That the better way to get them is through the fiscal court and on ground and that sort of thing. You're getting nicer, but I'll say this one last time. I want to know why your argument stood out over openings.
Yeah, that was like we spent their entire front half speech like trying to rewrite some extra arguments for us because it was very narrow ground. I feel like.
And it's hard because Aaron is a smart kid, and he has it real. You know, he does it the same way every time. He does philosophy and then he does the practical. You know, and he does the principle and then he does the practical, and it's a very elegant and simple way to argue, and it's clean, and judges love this principle shit. Right. You know, so okay, keep working. You're welcome. Yeah, save me some ice cream.